Chapter 13 of A Short Life of Abraham Lincoln. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. A Short Life of Abraham Lincoln by John G. Nicolay. Chapter 13. The Secession Movement. South Carolina's secession. Buchanan's neglect. Disloyal cabinet members. Washington's central cabal. Anderson's transfer to Sumter. Star of the West. Montgomery Rebellion. Davis and Stephens. Cornerstone Theory. Lincoln inaugurated. His inaugural address. Lincoln's cabinet. The question of Sumter. Seward's memorandum. Lincoln's answer. Bombardment of Sumter. Anderson's capitulation. It is not the province of these chapters to relate in detail the course of the secession movement in the Cotton States in the interim which elapsed between the election and inauguration of President Lincoln. Still less can space be given to analyze and set forth the lamentable failure of President Buchanan to employ the executive authority and power of the government to prevent it, or even hinder its development, by any vigorous opposition or adequate protest. The determination of South Carolina to secede was announced by the governor of that state a month before the presidential election, and on the day before the election he sent the legislature of the state a revolutionary message to formally inaugurate it. From that time forward the whole official machinery of the state not only led but forced the movement, which culminated on December 20th in the ordinance of secession by the South Carolina Convention. This official revolution in South Carolina was quickly imitated by similar official revolutions ending in secession ordinances in the state of Mississippi on January 9, 1861, Florida January 10th, Alabama January 11th, Georgia January 19th, Louisiana January 26th, and by a still bolder usurpation in Texas, culminating on February 1st. From the day of the presidential election, all these proceedings were known probably more fully to President Buchanan than to the general public, because many of the actors were his personal and party friends, while almost at their very beginning he became aware that the three members of his cabinet were secretly or openly abetting and promoting them by their official influence and power. Instead of promptly dismissing these unfaithful servants, he retained one of them a month, and the others twice that period, and permitted them so far to influence his official conduct that in his annual message to Congress he announced the fallacious and paradoxical doctrine that though a state had no right to secede, the federal government had no right to coerce her to remain in the Union. Nor could he justify his non-action by the excuse that contumacious speeches and illegal resolves of parliamentary bodies might be tolerated under the American theory of free assemblage and free speech. Almost from the beginning of the secession movement it was accompanied from time to time by overt acts both of treason and war, notably by the occupation and seizure by military order and force of the seceding states of 12 or 15 harbor forts, one extensive navy yard, half a dozen arsenals, 3 mints, 4 important custom houses, 3 revenue cutters, and a variety of miscellaneous federal property, for all of which insults to the flag and infractions of the sovereignty of the United States, President Buchanan could recommend no more efficacious remedy or redress than to ask the voters of the country to reverse their decision given at the presidential election, and to appoint a day of fasting and prayer on which to implore the Most High "to remove from our hearts that false pride of opinion which would impel us to persevere in wrong for the sake of consistency." Nor must mention be omitted of the astounding phenomenon that, Encouraged by President Buchanan's doctrine of non-coercion and purpose of non-action, a central cabal of Southern senators and representatives issued from Washington on December 14th their public proclamation of the duty of secession, their executive committee using one of the rooms of the Capitol building itself as the headquarters of the conspiracy and rebellion they were appointed to lead and direct. During the month of December, while the active treason of Cotton State officials and the fatal neglect of the Federal executive were in their most damaging and demoralizing stages, an officer of the United States Army had the high courage and distinguished honor to give the ever-growing revolution its first effective check. Major Robert Anderson, though a Kentuckian by birth and allied by marriage to a Georgia family, was, late in November, placed in command of the Federal forts in Charleston Harbor, and having repeatedly reported that his little garrison of 60 men was insufficient for the defense of Fort Moultrie, and vainly asked for reinforcements which were not sent to him, he suddenly and secretly, on the night after Christmas, transferred his command from the insecure position of Moultrie to the strong and unapproachable walls of Fort Sumter, midway in the mouth of the Charleston harbor, where he could not be assailed by the raw Charleston militia companies that had for weeks been threatening him with a storming assault. In this stronghold, surrounded on all sides by water, he loyally held possession for the government and sovereignty of the United States. The surprised and baffled rage of the South Carolina rebels created a crisis at Washington that resulted in the expulsion of the President's treacherous counselors and the reconstruction of Mr. Buchanan's cabinet to unity and loyalty. The new cabinet, though unable to obtain President Buchanan's consent to aggressive measures to reestablish the Federal authority, was, nevertheless, able to prevent further concessions to the insurrection, and to effect a number of important defensive precautions, among which was the already mentioned concentration of a small military force to protect the national capital. Meanwhile, the governor of South Carolina had begun the erection of batteries to isolate and besiege Fort Sumter, and the first of these, on a sand spit of Morris Island commanding the main ship channel, by a few shots turned back, on January 9th, the merchant steamer Star of the West, in which General Scott had attempted to send a reinforcement of 200 recruits to Major Anderson. Battery building was continued with uninterrupted energy until a triangle of siege works was established on the projecting points of neighboring islands, mounting a total of 30 guns and 17 mortars, manned and supported by a volunteer force of from 4,000 to 6,000 men. Military preparation, though not on so extensive or definite a scale, was also carried on in the other revolted states. And while Mr. Lincoln was making his memorable journey from Springfield to Washington, telegrams were printed in the newspapers from day to day showing that their delegates had met at Montgomery, Alabama, formed a provisional Congress, and adopted a constitution and government under the title of the Confederate States of America, of which they elected Jefferson Davis of Mississippi President and Alexander H. Stephens of Georgia Vice President. It needs to be constantly borne in mind that the beginning of this vast movement was not a spontaneous revolution, but a chronic conspiracy. The secession of South Carolina, truly said one of the chief actors, is not an event of a day. It is not anything produced by Mr. Lincoln's election or by the non-execution of the fugitive slave law. It is a matter which has been gathering head for 30 years. The central motive and dominating object of the Revolution was frankly avowed by Vice President Stephens in a speech he made at Savannah a few weeks after his inauguration. The prevailing ideas entertained by him, Jefferson, and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. Our new government is founded upon